He says, quote, "From my vantage point, the issue with Roy Moore comes down to 4 allegations. Here's the 4 allegations. Number 1, Beverly Young Nelson. Beverly Young Nelson claims that in 1977, when she was just 16 years old and Roy Moore was 30 years old, that he attempted to sexually assault her in a car, grabbing her neck, trying to forcibly force her head into his lap, and nothing happened, but that he tried to force her to do this. Now, this would be considered sexual assault." Nolte goes on to say, quote, "The yearbook that she and her attorney, Gloria Allred, dramatically waved around as proof of their relationship is an obvious forgery. Please note that I'm not couching my words in this forgery. There's no apparent or probable, leaving myself some wiggle room. It's forgery. I believe the yearbook is forged, and that blows all of Young's credibility, as does the fact that once the veracity of the yearbook was called into question after trying to talk around the obvious discrepancies, Gloria Allred suddenly disappeared. She went dark. Where's she been? At best, Allred and Nelson might be trying to frame a guilty man. Regardless, this claim is not worth spit." All right, now, I think this is a very fair point that he makes here, because handwriting experts have looked at the so-called writing there, and they see 2 different writing styles. So at a minimum, Roy Moore signed his name, and then somebody else wrote some other stuff, or at a minimum, at a maximum, Roy Moore wrote none of it. Don't really know. But for those that are saying, yes, that is Roy Moore, first of all, if you have inconsistent writing there and it looks like a forgery, whether it's a partial forgery or a full forgery, either way, that, in my opinion, blows a massive hole in the credibility of this woman's claim that she'd be willing to use dishonesty in any kind of forgery whatsoever regarding Roy Moore. And then the other thing that Nolte doesn't point out, but that I pointed out, is that let's pretend that you refuse to believe that this is a forgery and you believe that Roy Moore actually wrote that in the yearbook. You got to realize, according to this woman, he wrote it in the yearbook right before he attempted to sexually assault her. So if you believe Roy Moore did sign that, think about this logically, would any assistant district attorney getting ready to commit the crime of sexual assault, would he first sign his name to the yearbook of the person that he's getting ready to assault, thereby establishing a connection between him and his intended victim? I mean, how can anyone think any assistant district attorney would do something like that? So yeah, I consider this one a very not credible accusation, quite frankly. Okay, the second accusation he points out is Tina Johnson. He says, quote, "Tina Johnson claims that in 1991, while exiting Roy Moore's law office, that he grabbed her butt. I don't know whether or not to believe Johnson. If Moore did this, it was, of course, wrong. But the punishment needs to fit the crime, and I'm not willing to destroy a man over the disputed allegation of a 26-year-old butt grab," is what he says. This woman says she was 28 years old at the time. It says, "Moreover, this is the most recent allegation against Moore, all the way back to 1991. So far, no one has claimed Moore did anything untoward at all since 1991. This also matters," it says. So let's pretend Roy Moore did actually grab that woman's butt on the way out in a flirting with her kind of way. Is that wrong? Absolutely. Does that mean that if he did something like that 26 years ago, that rises to the level of his life and career must be destroyed and he can't even serve in the United States Senate? Does it rise to that level? That's the point Nolte's making. I think it's a very fair point. Then the third allegation is from Leah Korfman. Leah Korfman says that in 1979, when she was just 14 years old, a 32-year-old Roy Moore molested her in a cabin in the woods. And we all know the allegations here. She says that he took her out to this cabin in the woods and that he partially undressed her and partially undressed himself and kind of fondled her and such, but it didn't go farther than that. All right. Now, here's what Nolte says, quote, "This allegation is the most credible. I found Miss Korfman quite credible during her Today Show appearance on Monday, and I said so," which is true. And I said the same thing, actually. You watch this woman's appearance in her interview, it's like, well, she seems pretty credible. But I've also seen women make up stories that also appeared very credible. So how can you know for sure? But here's what Nolte points out. However, a big hole has now been blown in her story, which was first reported by the left-wing Washington Post. Korfman told the Washington Post that her encounter with Moore, quote, "set the course for her doing other things that were bad." She said this included drinking, drugs, boyfriends, and a suicide attempt when she was 16. However, court records released now document that the exact opposite was true. That it turns out that leading up to the time, before she was 14, she was that's when she had all of her prior problems. Leading up to the time that she had the alleged encounter with Moore. And as a matter of fact, they say that after the event, supposedly by 1980, the year after this event she alleged happened in 1979, in 1980, court records document that show she had, quote, "her disciplinary problem had improved greatly." There's also some other discrepancies in her story. Now, here's what Nolte says. "Not enough for me to write Korfman off entirely, but in a very dramatic made-for-TV fashion, Korfman is blaming all the miseries in her life on Roy Moore when the evidence directly contradicts that. In good conscience, there's just not enough reason for me to destroy an entire man over these allegations." And then, of course, you add to that, this is 1979. She stayed silent for 38 years. You bring it up now, but over the last 38 years, he's been running for all kind of office in Alabama Supreme Court, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's been running for elected office for 40 years in all kinds of high-profile cases in Alabama, and she stayed silent during all of those times until now suddenly he's getting ready to go into the U.S. Senate, and now suddenly these allegations come out. I think the timing of that does cause legitimate suspicion, folks. And then there's another thing that I got to bring up about this. Nolte doesn't point this out, but I have. Roy Moore's political opponents have been digging into his past for any kind of dirt for over 40 years. The way it works in politics, okay, you dig into the past, you interview people from childhood, you do everything you can to find any kind of dirt on political opponents. They've done that for 40 years, and they've never uncovered any of this. Until suddenly, coincidentally now, it comes out. So I do think that it's fair to say she might be lying. It's also fair to say she might be telling the truth. It's also fair to say it might be somewhere in the middle, where she really convinced herself that this actually happened, but her own exaggeration or in her own mind or whatever has conjured up more than it really was. Any one of those things are possible. I don't know. But when you're in the I don't know situation, and there are legitimate reasons to doubt, you don't destroy a man's career and alter the fabric of the entire United States Senate because of something like that. And that's the point that he's making, and I think that that's a very fair point. Which then brings me to the final point that Nolte addresses. And this goes into something that Nolte brings up, something that, I'll be honest with you folks, I really never thought about. And it's the issue of dating teenagers. The issue of dating teenagers. Because it does appear that when Roy Moore was 30, 31, 32 years old, that he dated women of all different ages. He dated women in their 20s, okay? But he also apparently, in some cases, dated women as young as 16 to 19 years old. 16, 17, 18, 19 years old. Now, the age of consent in Alabama at the time was 16. It's still 16 today. So there's nothing illegal about that. If a 30-year-old man wants to go out with a 17-year-old girl, they're allowed to do that in Alabama. There's nothing illegal about that. Now, do I consider it unseemly? Yes, I do. Do I consider that inappropriate? Yes, I do. There's even a certain creepiness to that. But Nolte points out something very interesting about the creepiness factor of that I didn't really think about, and I want to address, and I'll share with you what he says.